"I will use you or you'll lose your job," he said, staring straight into her eyes. With no money and her daughter between life and death, she had nowhere to run. But what began as submission turned into a dangerous game between pain and desire. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and leave your comment saying where you are listening from. 3:42 in the morning. The Vertex building sighed in the silence of the New York dawn, its 22 floors cutting through the sky like a cold blade against the stars hiding behind the pollution. Outside, the city slept the sleep of the just and the unjust. But inside those walls of glass and concrete, Sarah Foster squeezed the cloth in soapy water for the 1,000th time that night, observing how the droplets ran down the Carrara marble that reflected the emergency lights in ghostly hues. She had never imagined that at 38 she would be there, on her knees, cleaning the vestiges of someone else's arrogance. The expensive perfume still permeated the air, mixed with the smell of reheated coffee and important papers that decided the fate of people like her without them even knowing. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness that had accompanied her since Robert died, leaving her alone with a daughter who needed special care and bills that never stopped coming. Sophia. The girl's name echoed in her mind like a constant prayer. 10 years old, wheelchair, eyes that shone with the intelligence of someone who understood everything but couldn't express anything. A rare syndrome that doctors pronounced with difficulty and that cost more than Sarah earned in 6 months. Each movement of the cloth on the floor was a silent promise. One more day, one more night, one more step toward the treatment that might give Sophia back the chance of a vocal smile. The 16th floor had always been her favorite, not for the imported furniture or the stunning view of the city, but because there was a different peace there. The rooms were larger, the corridors wider, and she could work without feeling the weight of the stairs that sometimes followed her during the day. On that floor was the headquarters of Montgomery Financial Group, where men in suits discussed numbers she would never see in her bank account, and where women in high heels talked about investments as if choosing the color of nail polish. It was when she was crouched down, collecting papers that had fallen behind an executive desk, that she felt it. She didn't see it, she felt it. That heavy presence, as if the air had become denser, more charged. Sarah slowly raised her head and found herself facing a pair of extremely expensive Italian shoes, standing less than 6 feet away from her. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from something more primitive, more disturbing. Gabriel Montgomery was standing there, still as a statue of black marble, observing her with those eyes she had already seen in photographs scattered throughout the corridors, but which in person seemed to have the ability to penetrate the skin and read thoughts. Tall, broad shoulders, a suit that probably cost more than her annual salary, and an expression that oscillated between curiosity and something she couldn't decipher. It wasn't desire, it wasn't anger. It was something darker, more complex. "Good evening," he said, and his voice sounded like rough velvet, deep enough to make her stomach contract. It wasn't a greeting. It was almost a statement, as if he were declaring that now the night had become good because he had decided it would be so. Sarah swallowed hard and stood up slowly, very aware that her simple clothes contrasted brutally with his elegance. "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery," she murmured, her voice coming out weaker than she would have liked. "I'm sorry if I'm disturbing you. I can come back later to finish—" "No." The word cut through the air like a blade. "Continue." He approached a few steps, and Sarah could smell the expensive, woody perfume that seemed to have been created specifically for him. "How long have you been working here?" The question was simple, but the way he asked it carried a weight she didn't understand. 2 years, sir." 2 years. He repeated the words as if savoring them. "And always on the night shift?" "Yes, sir. It's quieter, and I need to be home during the day because of my daughter." The words came out before she could censor them. Why was she telling him about Sophia? Why was she providing personal information to the man who practically owned the city? Gabriel tilted his head slightly, like a predator studying its prey. "Daughter." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, as if he already knew, as if he already had access to information about her that she herself hadn't shared. "How old?" 10 years old. Sarah squeezed the damp cloth between her hands, needing something to hold on to. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel naked, exposed, as if he could see through the layers of strength she had built over the years. And the father? The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. Dead, she whispered, and hated how broken, vulnerable the word sounded. For a moment, something passed through his eyes. It wasn't compassion, it wasn't pity. It was something more dangerous, recognition. As if he understood the pain in a way that most people couldn't. I see. Gabriel moved a few steps closer, now close enough that she could see the small lines around his eyes, marks of a man who had seen more than he should have. Sarah Foster, isn't it? Her heart stopped. He knew her name. Not only did he know it, but he pronounced it as if he had said it thousands of times, as if it were familiar on his tongue. How did you... I know many things. The answer came loaded with an authority that didn't allow for questions. For example, I know that you need this job more than most people need to breathe. I know that your daughter has special needs that cost more money than you can imagine having. And I know that you would do anything for her. His words were like ice melting on her skin, cold and hot at the same time. Sarah felt cornered but couldn't move. It was as if she were hypnotized by that voice, by that presence that filled all the space around her. What do you want from me? The question came out in a whisper, but carried years of fatigue, fear, and desperation. Gabriel smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. That's what we're going to find out. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs, as if it wanted to escape from her chest and run away from that man, who was observing her with the intensity of someone deciphering a puzzle. Gabriel didn't move, didn't blink, just studied her as if she were a rare piece at an auction, and he was deciding if it was worth the investment. Do you know the difference between a desperate woman and a strong woman? The question came out of nowhere, loaded with a bitter philosophy that made Sarah frown. He continued without waiting for an answer. The desperate woman accepts any crumb. The strong woman negotiates even when she has nothing to offer. Sarah felt her blood boil. And which one do you think I am? For the first time, something that could be considered genuine amusement shone in his eyes. That's an interesting question. Very interesting. Gabriel began to walk around her slowly, like a predator evaluating its prey. You've worked here for 2 years, always at the same time, always alone. Never missed a day, never been late, never complained about the salary that barely pays for basic necessities. That tells me you're either very desperate or very dedicated. Each word was like a needle being jabbed into sensitive points she had tried to hide from the world. How did he know so much about her? Who had talked? Sarah forced herself to keep her head high, even when every instinct screamed for her to run away. And what does that have to do with you? She managed to ask, surprised by her own courage. Everything. The answer came with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because I have a proposal for you, Sarah. A proposal that can solve all your financial problems once and for all. Her heart leaped. Financial problems solved meant treatment for Sophia, meant a dignified life, meant not having to choose between paying rent or buying medications. But nothing in life was free, especially when it came from men like Gabriel Montgomery. What kind of proposal? Her voice came out firmer than she felt. Gabriel stopped walking and positioned himself right in front of her, so close that she could see the small golden flecks in his brown eyes, could feel the heat emanating from his body. You'll continue working here. Same time, same function. But some nights when I need it, you'll come to my office on the 22nd floor. Sarah felt her stomach turn. To do what? Whatever I tell you to. The answer came without beating around the bush, raw and direct like a slap in the face. Conversations, company, small favors. Nothing that will hurt you physically if that's what you're thinking. She swallowed hard, her mind running in circles. Small favors. Company. The words carried implications that she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. And in return? In return, your monthly cleaning salary will be multiplied by 10. Additionally, all your daughter's medical expenses will be covered. Private school, physical therapy, speech therapy, whatever she needs. Gabriel paused, letting the words echo in the heavy air. And when I no longer need your services, you'll receive an amount sufficient to guarantee her future. It was impossible. It was too good to be true. It was an offer that would solve all the problems that kept her awake during the few hours when she wasn't working. But Sarah had learned in the worst possible way that offers that seemed miraculous always came with a price that didn't appear on the tag. And if I refuse? His smile became colder, more dangerous. You won't refuse. How can you be so sure? Because I know exactly how much you owe in loans to pay for Sophia's last treatment. I know that your rent is 3 months late, and that Mrs. Martinez, your neighbor, only hasn't called the police because she feels sorry for you two. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made the words even more terrifying. I know that you sell sweets at the farmer's market on Sundays, and that even so you can't save enough money for the next medical appointment. Sarah felt her legs go weak. How did he know all this? How did he have access to such intimate information about her life? You investigated me. I investigate everything that interests me. Gabriel moved closer, so close that she could feel his breath brushing against her face. And you, Sarah Foster, interest me very much. There was something in the way he said her name that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just professional or sexual interest. It was something deeper, more disturbing. It was as if he knew her from somewhere, from some time, even though she knew that was impossible. Why? The question came out in a whisper. Why me? Gabriel tilted his head, studying her with that intensity that made her feel completely exposed. Because you have something I need. What? You remind me of someone. The words came loaded with an old pain, with a weight he had carried for years. Someone I should have protected and didn't. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a story there, something dark and complex that she didn't understand, but that explained part of his obsession with her. She wasn't just a cleaning lady who had caught his attention. She was a substitute for someone he had lost. I'm not her, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. No, Gabriel agreed. You're better. You're real. The air between them was charged with a tension that Sarah didn't know if it was sexual, emotional, or simply dangerous. Probably all three at the same time. She knew she should say no, that she should gather her things and run out of that building and never come back. But reality was a prison, and he was offering the key. How long would I have to decide? Gabriel smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes, but not in a way that reassured her. You've already decided, Sarah. You're just trying to find a way to live with the decision. He was right, and she hated it. Hated that he knew her better than she knew herself. Hated that he could read in her eyes the desperation she tried to hide. Hated that her only option was to accept becoming the property of a man who looked at her as if she were a broken doll he wanted to fix. When do we start? Her voice came out weak, defeated but loaded with a fierce determination. She would do anything for Sophia. Anything. Tomorrow night, midnight, 22nd floor. Gabriel stepped back a few paces, becoming again the impeccable businessman who commanded an empire. And Sarah? Yes? Wear something nice. 24 hours. That was how long Sarah had to process what had happened, to try to convince herself that she had dreamed of that encounter, that Gabriel Montgomery hadn't really made that absurd proposal, and that she hadn't really accepted it. But the access card he had discreetly left on her work table was too real, as was the number 22 engraved in gold that shone under the artificial light of the corridor. She spent the entire day taking care of Sophia, helping with physical therapy, pretending that nothing had changed. But every time she looked at her daughter, she saw not only the unconditional love that had always been there, but also the limitations imposed by the lack of money. The physical therapy sessions that needed to be more frequent, the private speech therapist who could help Sophia communicate better, the adaptive equipment that would make all the difference in the girl's quality of life. All this danced in her mind like a symphony of possibilities that had previously seemed unattainable. At 11:40 at night, Sarah was back at the Vertex building. She had chosen the only outfit she had that could remotely be considered nice, a simple navy blue dress that she wore on special occasions and that now seemed too inadequate for where she was going. Her hands trembled as she held the access card, watching the elevator numbers slowly rising to the 22nd floor. The 22nd floor was different from all the others. There wasn't the constant movement of the lower floors. There wasn't that frenetic energy of business. Here everything was silence, discreet luxury, and an oppressive sense of power. The walls were covered in dark wood. The lights were softer, and there was a smell of leather and expensive wood that permeated the air. Gabriel was waiting for her. He was sitting behind a mahogany desk that seemed to have been sculpted by angels, wearing a white shirt without a tie, the top buttons open, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. There was something more relaxed in his posture, but his eyes maintained that disturbing intensity that made her heart race. "Punctual," was the first word he said, without raising his eyes from the papers he was reading. "I appreciate punctuality." Sarah remained standing near the door, not knowing if she should approach or wait for instructions. She felt like an intruder in that environment that breathed money and power, as if she were profaning a temple just by her presence. "Come closer," he said, finally raising his eyes. "I won't bite you." "Not yet." The "not yet" made her stomach knot, but she obeyed, walking slowly until she was a few steps from the desk. Gabriel observed her attentively, his eyes roaming every detail of the blue dress, the way she had tried to fix her hair, the discreet lipstick she had applied. "Better," he murmured, as if approving an acquisition. "Sit down." She settled into the leather chair facing the desk, very aware that he continued to observe her as if cataloguing every movement, every reaction. The silence stretched for long minutes, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on one of the shelves. "Tell me about Sophia," he said suddenly, setting the papers aside and leaning back in his chair. The question caught her off guard. She had prepared herself for questions about herself, about her willingness to obey, about the limits of what she was willing to do. She hadn't expected him to want to know about her daughter. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." The answer came with an intensity in his eyes that made her feel as if he really wanted to understand, as if it wasn't just superficial curiosity. What she's like, what she likes, how you communicate. For the next half hour, Sarah found herself talking about Sophia in a way she hadn't done in years. She told how the girl loved music, how her eyes lit up when they heard certain songs, how she had developed her own way of communicating through gestures and expressions. She talked about the small advances they celebrated together, about the dreams she nurtured for her daughter's future. Gabriel listened in silence, occasionally asking specific questions that demonstrated he was really paying attention. There was something in his expression that Sarah couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just interest. It was as if he was genuinely touched by the stories she told. "She's lucky," he said when Sarah finished speaking, "to have a mother who loves her unconditionally." There was an old pain in those words, a wound that still bled even after years. Sarah wondered what kind of childhood he had had, what kind of family had shaped that man who mixed coldness and vulnerability in such a disturbing way. "Do you have children?" The question came out before she could contain herself. Something passed through his eyes, too quickly to be identified, but intense enough to make the air in the room heavier. "No." The way he said the word carried the weight of a story that she intuited was complex and painful. There was regret there, perhaps loss, definitely loneliness. "Never wanted any?" she insisted, surprising herself with her own audacity. Gabriel got up from his chair and walked to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. The lights of New York stretched to the horizon like an ocean of possibilities and shattered dreams. "Wanting and being able are very different things, Sarah." She observed the tense line of his shoulders, the way he kept his hands firmly clasped behind his back, as if forcing himself to maintain control. There was a vulnerability in that posture that completely contrasted with the image of the ruthless businessman she knew. "Why me?" The question came out in a whisper, but echoed through the room like a shout. "Of all the people you could have chosen, why me?" Gabriel remained with his back to her for long minutes, and when he finally turned, there was something different in his face. The mask of control had slipped slightly, revealing something more human, more broken. "Because you're the first person in years who makes me feel something beyond emptiness," he admitted, his voice lower, more vulnerable. "And because you need me as much as I need you." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with a brutal honesty that neither of them had expected. Sarah felt something move in her chest, an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't just gratitude for the money he was offering. It was something more dangerous, more complicated. "What do you need from me?" she asked, already knowing that the answer would change everything between them. Gabriel approached slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. When he stopped right in front of her, he extended his hand in a kind of silent invitation. "I need you to remind me what it's like to be human," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "And in return, I'll give you and Sophia everything you deserve." Sarah looked at the extended hand, knowing that this was the defining moment. Taking that hand meant entering a world from which she might never be able to exit. It meant becoming part of the life of a man who was simultaneously her salvation and her possible downfall. Slowly, she extended her own hand and touched his. The touch was electric, not in the romantic way you read about in books, but something more primitive, more disturbing. His hands were large, calloused in a way that didn't match the image of the polished businessman, and there was a tension in his fingers that suggested someone accustomed to holding things very tightly, so as not to lose them. When Sarah's fingers touched his, she felt a shiver that ran through her entire arm and settled in her chest like a hot, unsettling weight. Gabriel didn't pull her, didn't force her to stand up. He simply held her hand and remained there, observing her face as if memorizing every detail, every nuance of expression. It was as if that touch meant much more to him than it should, as if it were the first time in years that he had touched someone with genuine desire. "Thank you," he murmured, and there was something broken in those two words that made Sarah's heart contract. She didn't know what he was thanking her for accepting the proposal, for touching his hand, for simply being there. But there was such deep gratitude in his voice that she felt an unexpected wave of protection toward him. It was absurd. He was the most powerful man she knew, someone who could destroy her life with a movement of his fingers, and yet there was something in him that cried out for care. "You don't need to thank me," she said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice. "I should be the one thanking you for the opportunity." Gabriel released her hand slowly, as if he didn't want to break the connection, but knew he needed to. "It's not an opportunity, Sarah, it's a necessity. My necessity." The weeks that followed created a strange and disturbing routine. During the day, Sarah took care of Sophia, took her to medical appointments that were now paid for on time, observed the progress that began to appear thanks to the more advanced treatments they could finally afford. At night, she did her cleaning work as always, but 3 times a week at midnight, she went up to the 22nd floor. The meetings with Gabriel were a mystery in themselves. He never touched her inappropriately, never made explicit sexual demands. Instead, he seemed hungry for something much more intimate, conversations. He wanted to know about her childhood, about her dreams before Sophia, about the fears that kept her awake in the early hours. And strangely, he also talked. Not much, not everything, but small fragments of a life that had been built on foundations of pain. Gabriel had grown up in a rich but destroyed family, a father who confused discipline with cruelty, a mother who had disappeared when he was 12 years old. She didn't die, simply disappeared one morning, leaving behind only a note saying she could no longer pretend to love the life she had. He talked about this with a clinical coldness that made the words even more painful. "I learned early on that people leave," he said one night, while observing the city through the window. "The question is just how long you can convince them to stay." It was in these moments that Sarah saw the abandoned boy he had been, buried beneath layers of success and power. It was in these moments that she felt like hugging him, telling him that not all people leave, that some stay even when it's difficult. But she didn't do that. There was something in his posture that made it clear he wasn't asking for consolation. What disturbed her most was how he had become present in Sophia's life without ever having asked to meet her. Gifts arrived at their home, state-of-the-art medical equipment, adapted toys, braille books. When Sarah tried to thank him, he changed the subject with a coldness that left her even more confused. "Why do you do this?" she asked one night, after a private physical therapist had appeared at their door, saying his sessions with Sophia were already paid for a full year. "Do what?" Gabriel didn't even raise his eyes from the papers he was signing. "Take care of her. Of Sophia. I know it's you who's providing everything." Finally, he stopped writing and looked at her. "It's my money. I can spend it how I want. It's not about the money." Sarah approached the desk for the first time, taking the initiative in one of those meetings. "It's about why you care about a child you've never seen." The question hit a nerve. She could see it by the way the muscles in his jaw contracted, by the way he squeezed the pen between his fingers. "I don't care," he said, but the lie was stamped in his voice. "Yes, you do." Sarah sat on the edge of the desk, a boldness that a few weeks earlier she would never have had. "And I want to know why." Gabriel stared at her for long minutes, as if deciding whether to tell the truth or construct a convincing lie. "Because I was once a child who needed help and no one helped," he finally admitted, his voice so low she could barely hear it. The confession hung in the air between them, like a fragile bridge over an abyss. Sarah felt something move in her chest, an emotion she couldn't name but that made her want to approach him, touch his face, tell him everything would be all right. It was a maternal, protective impulse, completely inappropriate considering the nature of their relationship. "You're not a child anymore," she said gently. "No." Gabriel stood up and walked until he was right in front of her. "Then why do I still feel like that 12-year-old boy who stood waiting at the window for a mother who never came back?" The vulnerability in his voice completely disarmed her. Without thinking, Sarah extended her hand and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven beard, the warmth of his skin, the tension of the muscles that contracted under her touch. "Because childhood pain stays inside us forever," she whispered. "But that doesn't mean you're alone now." Gabriel closed his eyes and leaned slightly into her touch, as if it were the first genuine caress he had received in years. "Sarah," he murmured her name like a prayer, loaded with so much desire and vulnerability that she felt her heart speed up. "Yes?" "Don't let me fall in love with you." The plea hit her like a punch to the stomach. There was so much fear in those words, so much terror of being hurt again, that she felt tears prick her eyes. "Why not?" "Because I don't know how to love without destroying," he confessed, his eyes still closed, his voice broken. "And you've suffered enough." Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Here was a man who had everything that money could buy, but who was dying of emotional thirst. A man who had learned that love was synonymous with abandonment, that vulnerability was a weakness that would be exploited. "And what if I want to take the risk?" The words came out before she could censor them, loaded with a courage she didn't know she possessed. Gabriel opened his eyes and stared at her with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being undressed, not just physically, but emotionally. "Then you're either braver or more foolish than I imagined." "Maybe both," he smiled. And for the first time since they had met, it was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and illuminated his entire face. "Definitely both." And then, slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal, Gabriel leaned toward her. Sarah had time to back away, to say no, to maintain the safe distance that had been between them. But she didn't do that. Instead, she closed her eyes and let him kiss her. The kiss was like touching fire. It didn't burn immediately, but left a mark that Sarah felt hours later, as if his lips had etched something permanent onto hers. It wasn't a desperate or passionate kiss. It was careful, almost reverent, as if he were touching something sacred that could break at any moment. And perhaps he was. When they pulled away, Gabriel observed her with an expression she had never seen before, half amazed, half terrified. "That was a mistake," he murmured. But there was no conviction in his voice. If it was a mistake, it was the kind of mistake both of them wanted to make again. It was, Sarah agreed, but she didn't move away from him. "A terrible mistake." "You should leave," he said, but his hands moved to her waist, holding her as if she were a lifeline in the middle of a storm. "I should." She tilted her face toward his, allowing him to feel her breath against his skin. "But I won't." Something changed between them that night. The arrangement that had begun as a commercial transaction, blackmail disguised as opportunity, transformed into something more dangerous, mutual desire. And desire, Sarah knew from personal experience, was the most destructive emotion that existed. It was what had led her into Robert's arms, what had resulted in Sophia, what had shaped every important decision in her life. In the following weeks, the meetings on the 22nd floor became a complex dance between closeness and distance. Gabriel alternated between moments of disconcerting tenderness and periods of coldness that left her questioning whether she had imagined all the vulnerability he had shown. It was as if he were at war with himself, fighting against feelings that clearly terrified him. Sarah began to notice small details she had previously ignored, the way he always knew when she arrived at the building, even before their scheduled times. How he knew details about her routine that she had never shared. How sometimes she found Mrs. Thompson, the other cleaning lady, looking at her with a strange, almost worried expression. "You're different," commented Thompson one night, while they cleaned the bathrooms on the 15th floor. "More? I don't know, like, you're keeping secrets." Sarah pretended to focus completely on the sink she was scrubbing. "Everyone has secrets, Linda." "Yes, but some secrets are dangerous." The older woman moved closer, lowering her voice. especially when they involve men like him. Like who? Don't play dumb, girl. I know you've been going up to the 22nd floor, and I know it's not to clean. Sarah's blood ran cold. If Linda knew, others knew too, and if others knew, she was in danger. Not the kind of danger that came from Gabriel, but the kind that came from being associated with him in such an intimate way. Linda, please, listen here, the woman interrupted, grabbing Sarah's arm firmly. I've worked here for 15 years. I've seen things I shouldn't have seen, heard conversations that weren't meant for my ears. That man is not what he seems. What do you mean? Linda looked around, making sure they were alone. Do you know why the 22nd floor has a locked room that even he doesn't enter? Sarah frowned. She had noticed an always closed door at the end of the corridor, but had assumed it was just a storage or equipment room. No, because that's where they keep the things of the woman who died. The wife of his former partner. Everything sealed for 5 years since she died. Died how? Officially? Suicide. Jumped from the penthouse of the building one early morning. Linda paused, her dark eyes loaded with genuine concern. Unofficially. Nobody knows for sure, but she and Mr. Montgomery had a complicated connection. Sarah felt her stomach turn. What kind of connection? The kind that makes a married woman leave home at 2 in the morning to meet her husband's partner. The kind that makes a powerful man destroy his own company to get rid of his former partner. The kind that ends with someone dead. Linda's words echoed in Sarah's mind for days. She tried to convince herself that they were just employee gossip. Malicious speculation about people who had more money and power than she would ever have. But there was something in the way Linda had spoken, a certainty that came from intimate knowledge, that made her question everything she thought she knew about Gabriel. The next night, when she went up for the usual meeting, Sarah found herself observing Gabriel with different eyes, looking for signs of violence, of instability, of danger. But all she saw was the same man who had opened up to her, who had entrusted her with his deepest vulnerabilities. "You're distant today," he commented, noticing her restlessness. "I'm thinking." "About?" Sarah hesitated. How do you ask someone if they were responsible for another person's death? How do you question the man who is supporting your daughter's treatment about accusations that might just be the imagination of a bored cleaning lady? "About us," she finally said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Gabriel approached her, his eyes studying her face as if reading a complicated book. "And what conclusions did you reach?" "Hark, that I don't know anything about you." "Nothing real." He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "You know more than most people. Linda told me about the woman who died, your former partner's wife." The smile instantly disappeared from Gabriel's face. Something cold and dangerous flashed in his eyes for a moment, before being quickly controlled. "Linda talks too much. Is it true? What exactly do you want to know, Sarah?" His voice had returned to the cold, controlled tone that she hadn't heard in weeks. "If I killed her, if I'm capable of killing, if you should be afraid of me?" Each question was asked with a calmness that frightened her more than if he had shouted. "I just want to understand." "Understand what?" "Why a married woman chose to end her own life. Why sometimes people make choices we can't comprehend." Gabriel moved away from her, walking to the window as he always did when agitated. "Or do you want to understand if the man you're getting involved with is a murderer?" The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Murderer. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but couldn't distinguish if it was from fear or something more complicated. "Are you?" The question came out in a whisper. Gabriel turned slowly to face her, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something genuinely dangerous in his eyes. "If I were, would you be afraid enough to stop coming here?" "I don't know." "You should know," he approached again, but now there was something predatory in his movements. "Because once you're in my life, Sarah, there's no going back, and I protect what's mine with a ferocity that might frighten normal people." "Am I yours?" The words came out before she could think about them. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, loaded with a possessiveness that should have alarmed her, but instead made something warm spread through her chest. "And I am yours, and that's more dangerous for both of us than you can imagine." The possessiveness in Gabriel's voice should have been a bright red warning sign, but instead it made something primitive awaken in Sarah's chest. For years no one had claimed her. No one had wanted her with this fierce intensity. Robert had been gentle, caring, but he had never looked at her as if she were simultaneously his salvation and his downfall. He had never spoken about her as if she was something too precious to lose. "You didn't answer me," she insisted, although part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "About the woman who died?" Gabriel remained silent for long minutes, observing the city through the window. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice so low she could barely hear. "Helena Carter. She was beautiful, intelligent, married to my best friend since adolescence. And she was unhappy in a way that I recognized, because I saw the same unhappiness in the mirror every day." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You had an affair." "We did." There was no pride in the admission, just a deep old sadness. "For 2 years. She said she was going to leave her husband, that we would be together. I believed it because I wanted to believe. Because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me as if I were more than just the problematic son of a rich family." "What happened?" Gabriel turned to face her, and there was such raw pain in his eyes that Sarah felt the urge to approach and hug him. She discovered she was pregnant. By her husband, not me. And suddenly, I was no longer the escape from an unhappy life. I was just the mistake she needed to hide. And then she killed herself? Then she came here one early morning, went up to the penthouse and jumped. His voice was completely empty of emotion, as if he were reporting the weather. She left a letter saying she couldn't live with the guilt of what she had done, that she preferred to die than destroy the family she had built. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not just because of the tragedy of the story, but because of the way Gabriel had been abandoned again, left to deal alone with the guilt and pain of yet another person who had chosen to leave rather than fight. And the husband? Michael never knew about the affair, or at least never admitted knowing. He destroyed our partnership, obviously. He couldn't look at me without seeing the wife he had lost. Not that I blame him. Gabriel paused, running his hands through his hair. Some people can't live with painful memories. Is that why you keep her room locked? He looked at her with surprise. Linda really told you everything. She's worried about me. She should be. The answer came with a bitter smile. I have a tendency to fall in love with women I can't have. And this time what? This time I'm not going to let you escape. The words hung in the air between them like a promise and a threat. Sarah knew she should be afraid, that any sensible woman would run from there and never return. But she wasn't a sensible woman. She was a desperate woman who had found something she didn't know she was looking for, someone who looked at her as if she were the most important person in the world. "Can I see the room?" The question came out before she could censor it. Gabriel frowned. "Why?" "Because I need to understand. I need to know what I'm getting into." For a moment, she thought he would refuse. There was something possessive in the way he protected that room, as if they were memories he wasn't willing to share. But then he nodded slowly. "All right. But after that, I don't want any more questions about Helena. She's the past, Sarah. You're the present." The room at the end of the corridor was smaller than Sarah had imagined, but was filled with personal objects that told the story of an interrupted life. Clothes still hanging in the closet, photographs scattered across the desk, books with marked pages as if Helena would return at any moment to finish reading. But it was one photograph in particular that made Sarah's blood freeze. A blonde woman, smiling at the camera with light green eyes that she recognized immediately. Not because they were like hers were brown, but because they were identical to her mother's. "Gabriel," she whispered, picking up the photograph with trembling hands. "This woman, she looks like you." He had appeared behind her so quietly that she was startled. "It was one of the first things I noticed when I first saw you. The resemblance is disturbing." Sarah turned the photograph over and felt the world spin around her. On the back was written, "Helena Foster Carter, 1985, Foster, her family name." "She was my aunt," she whispered, her voice broken. "Helena was my father's sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Gabriel remained completely still behind her, and Sarah could feel the tension radiating from his body, like heat waves. When she finally managed to turn to face him, she saw an expression she would never forget: guilt, shock, and something that might have been relief. "You knew," she said, "and it wasn't a question. I suspected." "Since when?" Since the first time I saw your full name in the human resources files. Gabriel approached slowly, as if approaching an injured animal. Sarah Foster, daughter of Charles Foster, former state representative involved in corruption scandals, brother of Helena Foster. Sarah felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. That's why you chose me. It wasn't chance, it wasn't because I needed the job. It was because I'm related to her. In the beginning, yes, the admission came loaded with a brutal honesty. I wanted to understand the family that had produced a woman like Helena. I wanted to know if you carried the same fragility, the same propensity for destructive choices. And now? Gabriel extended his hand toward her face, but stopped before touching her, as if he no longer had the right. Now I know that you're infinitely stronger than she ever was, and infinitely more dangerous to me. Dangerous how? Because Helena never made me want to be a better man. She just made me want to escape the life I had. His eyes shone with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being set on fire from within. You make me want to build a life worth living. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Anger, sadness, betrayal, love, everything mixed in her chest in an emotional storm that left her speechless. You used me. Yes. You manipulated me. Yes. You lied to me. Yes. Gabriel moved closer, ignoring the fact that she was clearly furious, and I would do it all again if it were necessary to have you in my life. The brutal honesty of the confessions made him sound like a psychopath, but there was something in the way he looked at her that completely contradicted the coldness of the words. It was as if each admission of guilt was also a declaration of love. How can I trust you after this? You can't. The answer came without hesitation, and I don't deserve your trust. But I deserve a chance to prove to you that I can be the man you need. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process everything she had discovered. Helena was her aunt, the woman who had committed suicide after an affair with Gabriel. Gabriel had chosen Sarah because of this family connection, had orchestrated their meeting, had manipulated the whole situation. And yet there was something in his declaration of love that sounded genuine, desperate, real. If I stay, she said slowly, if I decide that I can forgive you, it will be with one condition. Anything. No more lies. No more manipulation. If we're going to do this, we do it as equals, not as predator and prey. Gabriel nodded slowly. And if I fail, if my nature is stronger than my desire to change. Sarah opened her eyes and faced him directly. Then I'll leave and take Sophia with me. And this time you won't find me. For a moment she saw genuine fear in his eyes, fear of being abandoned again, of losing the only person who had managed to touch his soul. And it was this fear, paradoxically, that convinced her that it might be worth trying. The 3 months that followed Sarah's ultimatum were the most intense in both of their lives. Gabriel, true to his word, began to open up in ways she had never expected. He told her about the shady businesses he had inherited, along with the financial empire, about the morally questionable decisions he had made to keep everything running, about the enemies he had made along the way. Each confession was like removing a layer of armor he had worn for decades. Sarah, in turn, found herself capable of an intimacy she had never experienced, not even with Robert. With Gabriel, she could be vulnerable without feeling weak, could express needs without feeling selfish. He not only listened when she talked about Sophia, but took initiatives that showed he really cared. Medical equipment appeared without her asking. Specialists from other states came to consult with Sophia. Experimental treatments were offered as if they were routine. It was during one of these moments of almost normal domestic happiness that the first real sign of danger appeared. Sarah had decided to take Sophia to see the new park they had built in the neighborhood, equipped with toys adapted for children with special needs. It was a sunny Saturday, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel that perhaps she could have a life beyond mere survival. Sophia was radiant in the adapted wheelchair that Gabriel had specially made for her. With controls, she could operate herself and safety systems that gave Sarah the peace of mind to let the girl explore with relative independence. Other children played around, and some even tried to communicate with Sophia using the basic signs she had developed. It was when Sarah stepped away for a few minutes to buy ice cream that it happened. A man approached Sophia, crouched beside her chair, and said something that made the girl's eyes widen in fear. When Sarah came running back, he had already disappeared, But Sophia was clearly disturbed, making frantic gestures that indicated fear and urgency. "What is it, my love?" "What did the man say?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, trying to decipher the desperate signs she was making. Sophia pointed to herself, then made a gesture, cutting her throat, and then pointed to Sarah. The message was too clear to be misinterpreted. Someone had threatened both her and her mother. That night, Sarah went up to the 22nd floor with an urgency she hadn't felt in months. Gabriel was in the office, as always, but something in his posture immediately alerted her. He was tense, shoulders rigid, looking out the window with an expression she hadn't seen since the first days of their relationship. "Someone threatened Sophia today," she said, without preamble. Gabriel turned slowly, and she could see that he already knew. "Tell me exactly what happened." Sarah reported the incident in the park, observing how his expression became progressively darker. When she finished, he remained silent for long minutes, clearly processing information she didn't possess. "This is my fault," he finally said, his voice loaded with a guilt that made her feel a chill in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "In recent months, I've made some business moves that didn't please certain people. People who don't hesitate to use any necessary means to send a message." Sarah felt the world spin around her. "Are you saying I put my daughter in danger by being with you?" "I'm saying that some people discovered that you're important to me, and now they're using that against us." Gabriel approached her, but for the first time in months, she backed away. "What kind of people, Gabriel? And don't come at me with evasions. You promised honesty." He sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair. "The kind of people who laundered money through your father's companies 15 years ago. The kind that eliminates problems instead of solving them. The kind that I should have confronted years ago, but chose to ignore because it was easier to pretend they didn't exist." Each word was like a stab. "My father was involved with criminals?" "Your father was the legal front they used to transform dirty money into clean investments. When he died, they lost an important piece of the scheme. And when Helena started asking questions about her husband's activities, she discovered things she shouldn't have known." "Are you saying Helena didn't commit suicide?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any answer. Gabriel stared at her with eyes that carried years of guilt and regret. "She came to me the night she died," he finally confessed. "Said she had found documents that proved Michael was being blackmailed, that he wasn't a voluntary partner in certain activities. Said she was going to the police the next day. And you stopped her. I tried to convince her to wait, to give me time to find a solution that wouldn't result in the death of everyone involved, including herself." His voice was broken, loaded with a regret that had corroded his soul for years. But she was determined. Said she couldn't live anymore knowing that people were being harmed because of her silence. And then she died. And then she was murdered. The confession came out as a whisper, but echoed through the room like a shout. "And I couldn't protect her, just as I couldn't protect anyone I've ever loved." Sarah felt nausea rise in her throat. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I wanted to believe that this time would be different, that I could keep you safe, that my past wouldn't reach you." Gabriel approached again. This time she didn't back away, but not because she trusted him, because her legs simply couldn't move. "But now they know about you, about Sophia, and they'll use you two to force me to do things I swore I would never do again." "What kind of things?" "Silence people who ask inconvenient questions. Facilitate money transfers that finance illegal activities. Be again the bridge between the legal world and the underworld I tried to leave behind." Sarah sank into a chair, trying to process the fact that her life had become a crime movie without her realizing it. "And if you refuse? Then they'll go after you and Sophia." The answer came loaded with a certainty that terrified her. "And this time I won't be able to stop it." "Then let's leave. We'll get out of New York, change our names, start somewhere else." Gabriel shook his head sadly. "People like these have worldwide reach, Sarah. There's no place on the planet where we could hide forever." "Then what do we do?" For a moment, she saw the vulnerable man who hid behind the ruthless businessman. She saw the boy who had been abandoned by his mother, the teenager who had grown up without trusting anyone, the man who had lost the only woman he loved to the violence he himself had helped create. "We do what Helena should have done," he finally said, his voice firm with a determination she hadn't heard before. We collect evidence, document everything, and deliver it to the right authorities. And if they find out before we succeed? Gabriel faced her with an intensity that made her feel as if he were engraving every detail of her face in his memory. Then at least we tried. And if we die trying, at least Sophia will grow up knowing that her mother died fighting for justice, not running away like a coward. It was a terrible, desperate, potentially suicidal proposal. But it was also the first time Gabriel had proposed to fight instead of hide, to face the past instead of trying to escape it. And for the first time since she had met him, Sarah saw in him the man he could have been if he had made different choices throughout his life. "All right," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "But this time we do it together. As partners, not as protector and protected." Gabriel smiled, and it was the first genuinely happy smile she had seen on his face. "Together," he agreed. Neither of them noticed the hooded figure who observed them through binoculars from the building across the street, photographing every moment of that conversation through the illuminated window. The plan was simple in theory, but complex in execution. Gabriel had used his contacts in the corporate world to access documents that had been carefully buried for years. Suspicious bank transfers, phantom contracts, correspondence that showed how a group of businessmen had used politicians like Sarah's father to launder money from criminal activities. Each document was a piece of the puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal a network of corruption that reached the highest echelons of power in New York. Sarah, in turn, had become an unlikely but efficient investigator. Her position as a cleaning lady gave her access to offices after hours, allowing her to photograph documents left on desks, copy passwords from computers that executives typed without realizing someone was watching. It was dangerous but also empowering. For the first time in her life, she felt she had control over her situation, that she wasn't just a victim of circumstances. For 2 weeks, they worked as a perfect team. Gabriel provided information on where to look, Sarah gained access to the documents, and together they built a dossier that would be sufficient to bring down powerful people and send several of them to prison. It was meticulous, dangerous work, but it united them in a way that physical passion never had. It was on a Thursday that everything collapsed. Sarah was on the 22nd floor, organizing the latest evidence they had collected, when her phone rang. The number on the screen was from Sophia's school, and the chill that settled in her stomach was immediate and visceral. Sophia never called from school. She couldn't speak on the phone. "Mrs. Foster?" The principal's voice was loaded with a concern that made Sarah's heart stop. "You need to come here immediately. Sophia had an accident." "What kind of accident?" The words came out strangled, as if her throat had closed. She fell down the stairs, or rather, was pushed. "We're calling the ambulance now, but she's conscious and—" Sarah didn't even wait to hear the rest. She hung up the phone and ran to the elevator, her hands trembling so much she could barely press the button. Gabriel, who had witnessed the conversation, didn't ask questions. He simply followed her, his expression as grim as hers. The hospital became a blur of white corridors, the smell of disinfectant, and voices whispering words she didn't want to hear. Contusions, possible concussion, multiple fractures in the left leg. Sophia was sedated when they finally got to see her, her little face pale amid the cables and monitors that now surrounded her. "Who did this to her?" Sarah whispered to the nurse who was checking the girl's vital signs. "According to the other children, it was a man who said he knew you. He pushed Sophia when she was at the top of the stairs and then ran away." The nurse hesitated before continuing. "The police want to talk to you." The detective who took the case was a middle-aged man with tired eyes that had already seen too much. Detective Martin asked routine questions at first: where Sarah was at the time of the accident, if she had enemies, if anyone had made recent threats. But when Gabriel appeared at the hospital, everything changed. "Interesting," murmured the detective, observing Gabriel with an expression Sarah couldn't decipher. "Mr. Montgomery, I didn't expect to see you here." "She knows my wife," Gabriel said simply, the lie coming so naturally that even Sarah almost believed it. "Wife?" The detective looked at Sarah with renewed interest. "I didn't know you had married again, Mr. Montgomery, especially after the incident with Mrs. Helena." The air in the room became heavy. Sarah felt as if she were watching a play for which she didn't know the script. where each line carried hidden meanings she couldn't comprehend. "That was a long time ago," said Gabriel, but there was a tension in his voice that the detective clearly noticed. 5 years isn't that long. And curiously, now we have another incident involving a woman connected to you. The detective leaned forward in his chair. "The girl who was attacked is the daughter of Mrs. Foster, correct? Same surname as the late Helena Foster." Sarah felt her blood freeze. The detective knew about the family connection. He knew about the relationship between her and Gabriel. And by the way he looked at them, he clearly suspected that the attack on Sophia hadn't been random. "What exactly are you insinuating?" Gabriel's voice had acquired a dangerous tone that Sarah recognized from the first days of their relationship. "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm investigating." The detective opened a folder and spread some photographs on the table. "These were taken last week. The two of you in his office, apparently discussing something very serious. Documents spread across the desk. It almost looks as if you were investigating something." The photographs were too clear, taken with professional equipment through the window of the 22nd floor. Sarah could see herself clearly in several of them, holding documents, pointing to papers, clearly involved in something that went far beyond a casual romance. "Who took these photos?" Sarah managed to ask, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "People interested in Mr. Montgomery's activities," replied the detective. "People who became concerned when they learned he was collecting information about certain business activities from the past." Gabriel rose slowly, his expression completely closed off. "If you have something to accuse me of, detective, do it. Otherwise, I'm going to take care of my family. I don't have anything to accuse you of yet, but I have an injured child, and evidence that you two are messing with things that some people prefer remain buried." The detective collected the photographs. "My advice? Stop digging up the past before someone else gets hurt." When they left the police station, Sarah was trembling so much she could barely walk. "They know," she whispered. "They know everything." "They don't know everything," corrected Gabriel, but there was a worry in his voice that frightened her more than any direct threat. "But they know enough to be dangerous. And now?" Gabriel stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, observing the movement of the city around them, as if seeing everything for the last time. "Now I need to disappear for a while." "What?" Sarah turned to face him, feeling as if the ground were collapsing under her feet again. "You can't abandon me now. Not after what happened to Sophia." "It's exactly because of what happened to Sophia that I need to go." Gabriel held her by the shoulders, forcing her to look into his eyes. "As long as I'm near you, you'll be in constant danger. I need to find a way to resolve this without putting you two in the line of fire. And if you can't, if they kill you like they killed Helena?" For the first time since they had met, Gabriel smiled with a sadness that broke her heart. "Then at least you two will be safe." "No." Sarah moved away from him, anger beginning to overcome fear. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself. Not after everything we've been through together." "Sarah, no!" Her voice echoed down the street, making some people turn to look. "If you leave now, if you abandon me when I need you most, I'll never forgive you, never." Gabriel stared at her for long minutes, as if memorizing every detail of her face. Then slowly he leaned in and kissed her with a desperation that made her feel as if the world were ending. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "And that's why I need to go." And then he walked away, moving down the street without looking back, leaving Sarah alone on the sidewalk with a broken heart and an injured daughter who needed care that she didn't know how to provide alone. The public hospital in downtown New York had never seemed so welcoming as it did that night. Sarah held Sophia in her arms, ignoring the girl's protests that she was already too big to be carried, but needing the physical contact to calm herself. They positioned themselves in the emergency area, where the constant movement of people ensured they wouldn't go unnoticed if something happened. Sophia made gestures asking why they were there, why her mother seemed so nervous, why they had left home so quickly. Sarah tried to explain through the signs they had developed together, but how do you explain to a 10-year-old child that their lives were in danger because of secrets that had existed since before she was born? It was when she saw Gabriel crossing the lobby that Sarah felt as if she could breathe again. He was different, thinner, bearded, wearing simple clothes that contrasted with the expensive suits he used to wear. But his eyes were the same, and when they found hers across the crowd, They carried the same intensity that had captivated her from the first meeting. Sophia recognized Gabriel immediately and made a gesture of joy that broke Sarah's heart. The girl had felt his absence as much as she had, and seeing him again was like completing a family they didn't even know was incomplete. "How are you two?" Gabriel's first question was directed to Sophia, who responded with a series of enthusiastic gestures that made him smile genuinely for the first time in months. "She's asking where you were and why it took you so long to come back," translated Sarah, observing how he knelt to be at the girl's level. "Tell her I was fighting dragons to keep you two safe," he said, making Sophia laugh with his dramatic interpretation of the gestures. "And now that the dragons have been defeated, I can stay forever." The word forever made something move in Sarah's chest. Have the dragons really been defeated? Gabriel stood up and faced her with a seriousness that made her realize there was still a battle to be fought. "Not all of them yet, but I have the necessary weapons now." He showed a folder similar to the one she carried. "And you do too, from what I see." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion in the lobby caught everyone's attention. Commander Reynolds had entered the hospital with two men in civilian clothes, but it was impossible not to recognize the police authority in their posture. Their eyes methodically scanned the crowd, looking for specific faces. "It's him," whispered Gabriel, instinctively positioning himself between Reynolds and the women. He saw me. What happened next was simultaneously terrifying and surreal. Reynolds approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, greeting Gabriel as if they were old friends who had met by chance. "Mr. Montgomery, what a surprise to find you here." The commander's voice was too cordial, loaded with a barely disguised threat. "And this must be the famous Mrs. Foster." Sarah felt Sophia cling tighter to her, the girl instinctively perceiving that this man represented danger, even without completely understanding what was happening. "Commander," replied Gabriel with a calmness that Sarah knew he didn't feel, "I imagined our paths would cross eventually. Especially considering that you've been very interested in matters that don't concern you." Reynolds took a step closer, his men positioning themselves to block possible escape routes. Old documents, recordings that should have been destroyed years ago, things that can cause unnecessary misunderstandings. It was then that Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of backing away, she stepped forward, placing herself beside Gabriel rather than behind him. "Misunderstandings?" Her voice came out stronger than expected. "Like murdering my aunt to cover up crimes you were committing." Reynolds' smile faltered. "Be careful with accusations you can't prove, ma'am." "I can prove it." Sarah raised the folder she carried. "I have the recordings that Helena hid before she died. I have the photographs of the secret meetings. I have the bank records that show exactly how you were being paid to protect the money laundering network." For a moment, Reynolds looked genuinely surprised. Clearly, he hadn't expected that a simple cleaning lady would have had access to such compromising evidence. "And even if that were true," he said slowly, "who would believe the word of a desperate woman against a respected police commander?" "Maybe nobody," admitted Sarah, "but the FBI believes in evidence, and they're receiving copies of all this right now." That was the cue Gabriel had been waiting for. While Reynolds was distracted processing Sarah's words, he made a discreet signal to someone who was observing from a distance. Immediately, federal agents began to approach from different directions, discreetly surrounding the group. "Commander August Reynolds," said one of the agents, identifying himself, "you're under arrest for the murder of Helena Foster Carter and for criminal organization." What followed was controlled chaos. Reynolds tried to resist, claiming it was all a setup, that there wasn't sufficient evidence. But the folders that Gabriel and Sarah carried contained years of meticulous documentation, enough to connect him not only to Helena's death, but to an entire network of corruption that extended through various spheres of power. As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, he shouted a final threat in their direction. "You don't know who you're messing with." This won't end here. But Sarah didn't feel afraid. For the first time in years, she felt powerful, capable, free. She had confronted the man who had destroyed her family, and won. Not alone, but also not as a helpless victim, as a fighter. 6 months later, Sarah woke up on a Saturday morning to the sound of Sophia laughing in the yard of the new house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs. bought with the money Gabriel had managed to recover from the criminal schemes he had helped dismantle. Sophia was in the therapeutic pool they had built, her legs moving in ways that doctors had said were impossible just a year before. Sophia's progress had been remarkable since they had left the world of threats and fear, as if emotional security had unlocked physical capabilities that had been blocked by stress. She still used a wheelchair for long distances, but could walk short distances and, miracle of miracles, had begun to speak isolated words. "Mum" had been the first clear word she said 3 months ago. Gabriel had been the second 2 weeks later. Sarah observed through the kitchen window as Gabriel helped Sophia with exercises in the pool. He had transformed into a dedicated father for a child who wasn't biologically his, but who loved him unconditionally. And Sophia had transformed into the daughter he never thought he could have. "Good morning, Mrs. Montgomery," said Gabriel, appearing in the kitchen and hugging her from behind as she prepared breakfast. Mrs. Montgomery. It still sounded strange, even 3 months after the wedding. It had been a simple ceremony, just the 3 of them and a few close people. But it had been perfect, because it had been real, based on genuine love instead of need or manipulation. "Good morning, husband," she replied, turning to kiss him. It was an everyday kiss, domestic, full of promises of many more days like this. "Sophia wants to know if she can invite her new friend for a sleepover tonight," he said, smiling. "And I want to know if you're happy." The question was asked regularly, as if he still couldn't completely believe that she had chosen to stay, that she had forgiven the initial manipulations, that she was building a life with him out of love and not obligation. "I'm happy," she answered. And this time there was no hesitation or reservations in the response. "I'm complete." Gabriel kissed her again, more deeply this time, as if he were still memorizing every moment of happiness, storing them against possible dark futures that his mind still insisted on imagining. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "And I love the life we've built together. Even with all the drama we faced to get here, especially because of the drama," he said, smiling, "because it proved to me that you're strong enough to stay with me no matter what happens. And it taught me that I can be the man you and Sophia deserve." From the yard came a shout of joy from Sophia, followed by a splash in the pool. They laughed together, and Sarah felt her heart overflow with a happiness she had thought was impossible just a year before. They had faced together the worst that life could offer: betrayal, violence, threats, separation, fear. But they had survived, and more than that, they had emerged stronger, more united, more aware of the value of what they had built. At night, when Sophia was already asleep, and they were alone in the bedroom they shared, Gabriel held Sarah against his chest as she lazily traced circles on his skin. "I don't have nightmares anymore," she said suddenly. "About what?" "About losing you. About not being strong enough. About Sophia not having the future